It's not about need, Caroline. I want food that don't make me sick. I want walls that hold back the wind. I want a decent life.
A tale as old as time. The story of Edward Kenway, I think, is one many of us can relate to. It's a story beginning out of a personal desire for a better life. The earliest sequence we get between him and his wife Caroline outlines his personal wants simply. While he speaks of a fortune and having his pockets stuffed with gold, the root of that desire comes from wanting a decent life. To be able to partake in food that doesn't make him sick, and to live in a house where, whenever you hear a strong gust of wind coming, there's no fear of your home being blown away. He's at his wit's end. He's had a hard life, so much so that he'd rather risk a dangerous life earning what he feels is rightfully his than to serve within the British Navy, receive a proper wage, and not face such dangerous circumstances. It's a naturally human response to just want more. After being beaten down your whole life, you decide to just not settle anymore and take a leap of faith. Take what's yours and enjoy the fruits of your labor without having to answer to anyone. The problem is one that is inherent to the desire of changing your current lifestyle, especially when there's other people around you. It doesn't just affect you. And you see that in the earliest stages with his wife Caroline. They argue and they fight over the wisdom behind Edward wanting to become a privateer. A decision Caroline's parents are so against it instills a lack of faith, resulting in her leaving out of a mixture of sparing her own feelings and abiding to her parents' wishes of looking out for herself. I do want to note from the scenes we're given, Caroline was Edward's emotional support, and without her backing, as he says, she left him when he needed her most. But he committed to his desire, so much so that he would go on to fixate on riches, an evolution from his original wants of just having a decent life. This fixation would create what appeared to be a lack of any commitment to grander convictions beyond fortune and personal pleasure, a position that doesn't really suit Edward as he's not devoid of emotion. He'd go on to lose personal friends, screw up a fight he didn't care to understand, mock the Assassin's Creed, and only after realizing he was truly walking a path alone and lost everybody within his life that he cared most about, did he decide to devote his life to fix all the wrong that he had committed. Based off the title, it's an Assassin's game. Gameplay, pirate simulator. Canonically, a connection of what came before and what's coming after. Narratively, it's a human story of someone who lost himself without realizing it. He was blinded by fortune, thinking he was committing to the promise of sending for his wife, only to discover time and good fortune doesn't always work in our favor.
That old muckworm! He's wrong about me!
I hope it's so.
You believe me, don't you? Can you not see me? Standing out there on the deck of a ship that's sliding into port.
Born on March 10, 1693 in Swansea, Wales, Edward Kenway was the son of Bernard Kenway of Manchester and Lynette Hopkins of the nearby city of Cardiff. While the details of Edward's earliest years aren't clearly documented, what we do know from the age of 10 onward paints a fairly vivid picture of his upbringing, and more importantly, how it shapes his growing desire for something beyond it. At 10 years old, his father moved the family to a small farm just outside of Bristol, a nearby port town. For a kid at that age, the change in environment was dramatic. Uprooted from what he knew, Edward struggled to adjust, gradually falling into a more depressive state that only seemed to deepen over time. Cut off from old friends and without any real outlet for what felt like an endless reserve of energy, he began to feel trapped in a life that seemed far smaller than anything he had ever imagined for himself. The daily rhythm of farm work, combined with the isolation and stark contrast from a past life filled with freedom and companionship, would go on to weigh heavily on him, undoubtedly painting this new life and seemingly overall career trajectory in a negative light, believing that this narrow existence was something that he would inherit, and so he would begin to outright reject it. As he moved into his teenage years, Edward started spending more and more time in the nearby town of Bristol, eventually abandoning any serious interest in becoming a farmer altogether, leaving the responsibilities for his family. As he, within Bristol, fell in with rough company, spending freely on drinking and chasing excitement wherever he could as his own way of escaping this limited and unfulfilling life that he believed he was trapped in. The irony, just as his sense of direction was completely lost on him, as this period of his life was marked less by progress and more by trouble. But things would change in 1711. At the age of 17, Edward would go on to meet Caroline Scott for the first time. Unlike Edward's background, which, while not wealthy, doesn't suggest any real deprivation, Caroline was raised in a more modest but structured household. Her upbringing emphasized discipline, education, propriety, a very stark contrast to the increasingly directionless path Edward had begun to fall down. A path Caroline first experienced on the very first day they met. Their paths crossed in the aftermath of a drunken altercation Edward had gotten himself into. As Caroline had come into town to retrieve one of her servants, it would just so happen to be that she found Edward in the middle of escorting that woman out of the grasp of one of Bristol's more notorious cats. Grateful for his intervention, Caroline agreed to meet Edward again under more proper circumstances, though she hardly considered the possibility of anything beyond that, especially nothing even remotely romantic. And yet, against most expectations, that's exactly what followed. Over time, Edward and Caroline grew close, and before long, the two had fallen deeply in love, much to the dismay of Caroline's father, Emmett Scott, who had already promised his daughter to the son of a wealthy East India Company executive. And he made his disapproval of Edward clear at every opportunity, but his objections ultimately carried little power, as Edward's charm, persistent as it was, won out, and within a year of their first meeting, in the year of 1712, he and Caroline would end up getting married. It was a union that not only angered her father, but also became a point of gossip throughout the entire town of Bristol. In the early months of their marriage, Edward seemed determined to build a proper life for them, to do a complete 180 and do his best in providing for Caroline, to step into what he believed a man in his position ought to be. Unfortunately, that resolve and newfound direction didn't last long. His grand ambitions paired with an inflated sense of what he was capable of achieving kept him from committing to the steady responsibility their situation required. And within a year, as they say, old habits die hard, and he slipped back into drinking, fighting, and idleness yet again. For a time, it seemed as though their unlikely pairing might still find its footing, though. Edward did genuinely love Caroline, but that love was constantly undermined by his lack of discipline and his disregard for stability. He couldn't accept the idea of settling into a modest middle-class life. Instead, his attention turned outward, becoming fixated on the idea of sailing to the West Indies, either to fight as a privateer against the Spanish or, failing that, to acquire land and establish a sugar plantation of his own. Funny how plans like that play out. You reject becoming a farmer, but once you're in married life, if your plans fail, then you accept your fate of mediocrity. Caroline would try to dissuade him, but it made little difference. His ambitions had already taken control over him. Fed up with Edward's drunken behavior and increasingly unrealistic ambitions, their marriage had already begun to strain after only a year of being together. But things grew far more complicated when Caroline discovered she was pregnant. For her, this became the breaking point. It finally pushed her to listen to her parents and leave Edward, as she no longer believed he was capable of becoming the kind of responsible father their child would need. And yet, despite how decisive that moment was for her, she chose not to tell Edward about the pregnancy at all. Instead, just deciding to pack her bags and leave for her parents' house one day. From his perspective, her sudden withdrawal felt abrupt and confusing. It was a complete reversal from the support she had once shown him. A heavy blow, but not one strong enough to pull him away from the idea that had already taken hold of him. A hold that's plain to see the day he finds her packing her bags. Drunk, hearing her father was right, he had a decent wage working the farm, Edward snapped, likening that job to robbery, asking if she wanted to be married to a peasant her whole life. His underlying feelings of thinking that was beneath him, that he deserved more, they deserved more. The root of his ambition appeared to lay in status and wealth more than practicality. Knowing she was going to be a new young mother, that was exactly what Caroline needed. A mental shift that she adopted, and one that Edward could never come to accept without knowing that he was going to be a parent as well. Was he delusional? Was Caroline at fault for not sharing news of their child? To be fair, falling back into reckless drinking, fighting, daydreaming, and refusing to take care of your wife, at least in the sense of providing a stable income, is hard to defend. Just as it was hard to at least come to a compromise. Caroline expressed worries of Edward being injured in privateering. If it was thrill he was after, why not sail with the Royal Navy, accept a proper wage, and not face such dangers privateering had? An idea Edward rejected outright due to the uneven distribution of wealth. Additionally, he would go on to justify that as not wanting to worry about the security of his life. Being decent, that's what he was after. Attainable through the life of high risk and higher reward, and sailing with the Navy, to him, meant there was no point. It was a different avenue to the same outcome of being limited underneath other people. In Edward's defense, this appeared to be his habits, his nature, the point that he reverted back to. He does sound to have good intentions, he just lacked the gravity to bring him down to reality. And with Caroline at least not providing an additional reason to force him to think practically, it is hard to justify on her behalf that she did everything in her power to make it all work. Wherever you sit on the side of this argument, though, Edward would go on to make one final attempt to win her back. He would head to her parents' home and ask her to come home, to trust in his vision and believe that he could make something of himself out on the open sea. The request to come home really does feel as if it was more akin to begging her to be the one thing he never had, a person who believed and supported the idea there was something more out there for him. It's a role that undoubtedly would have been all the more motivating and uplifting coming from her, his wife he was madly in love with and willing to do anything for. The time away from Edward, as small as it may have been, would turn out to be enough to harden her resolve against the idea. Thanks to the closer proximity of her parents, most likely doing their best to disintegrate the marriage with someone they never liked or approved of, especially thanks to him completely destroying her father's plans of marrying Caroline off to a better, established, well-respected man, by the time Edward came to her parents' house and begged her to return home, the damage was done. By then, Caroline saw it for what she believed was a fool's errand, refusing to return, as she shares she is unable to bear the thought of what might happen to him if he went through with all of this. And this is what appears to be their final interaction together.
I've an awful feeling about this. You'll be hurt out there. I couldn't handle that.
I'll be careful, I promise. And when I'm flush with coin and set up, I'll send for you. I will.
Caroline, come away! Don't exert yourself!
I can't promise I'll come, Edward. If you leave on this fool's errand, I cannot promise anything.
Don't give up on me, Caroline. Not when I need your faith the most.
A month later, Edward still made his way to the West Indies, where he fell in with the privateer Benjamin Hornigold and his quartermaster, a man by the name of Edward Thatch. Over the first half of 1713, the three gradually came to know each other quite well, with Hornigold and Thatch both experienced sailors taking Edward under their wing and teaching him the practical realities of life as a privateer, as well as life out in the open sea. This period of stability wouldn't last long, though, as later that year, the Treaty of Utrecht would formally be signed. This would officially bring an end to what is now known as the War of Spanish Succession, and with England and Spain no longer at war, privateering as a legal enterprise came to an abrupt end, cutting off the flow of opportunity that had sustained men like these three and leaving many suddenly without any purpose or income. Now poor, unemployed, and thousands of miles from home, Edward and his companions made their way to the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, where they settled in a small town by the name of Nassau. From here, they began to reconsider what options, if any, were left to them in a world that had little use for their skills in times of peace. For Edward, this period introduced him to a way of life that felt entirely removed from the one he had known before, as Nassau existed in a state that was loose, disorderly, and largely ungoverned, filled with noise, indulgence, and a sense of freedom that felt natural to him. This became his home, away from home. Finally, a place where he can truly be himself without any sense of judgment, rejection, or feeling like anything you end up earning has to go to somebody else. It was the exact kind of life that Edward was basically living back in Bristol, albeit here it was actively encouraged. Even with this environment, however, Caroline remained on his mind, and despite how easily he became absorbed in the rhythm of Nassau, he continued to hold on to the idea that if he could establish something resembling a stable life here within the West Indies, perhaps through work on a sugar plantation, he might still find a way to return to her after so much time apart. But without any firm sense of direction or commitment to that future, he again would gradually slip back into what was familiar, and it was only a matter of time Edward returned to the sea, alongside the same men he had come to depend on, no longer as privateers operating under the authority of the crown, but as pirates, owing nothing to king or country, while carrying with them the ever-present understanding that such a life rarely ended on their own terms.
Julian, guest of honor has arrived, Mr. Duncan Walpole.
Julien Ducasse. I hope your conversion to our order is an honest one.
This brings us to our introduction to Edward, who we first see caught in the middle of a violent storm off Cape Bonavista in the Caribbean. The timeline puts us roughly a year and a half after leaving Caroline in June of 1715, placing him uncomfortably close to that promise he once made of being gone no longer than 2 years. In the middle of heavy rain and rough, unrelenting seas, he's dealing with more than just the weather. as the ship he's serving on finds itself locked in an ongoing engagement with a fleet of enemy vessels, turning this already dangerous situation into one resembling a little bit more of desperation. Although he's not the captain, the sequence does immediately establish Edward's instinct to take action, as a volley of cannon fire knocks him to the deck and a large shard of wood drives into his right bicep, which he quickly pulls free without thinking twice about, moves on to regain control of the cannon he had been manning. However, before he can settle back into position, word reaches him that the helmsman has been killed, prompting Edward to abandon the cannon and move to take control of the ship himself, and directly placing him in charge of everyone's lives on board this ship. What I want to highlight here in the opening sequence of this game is how naturally he adapts to the situation in front of him, as he steers through the violent waves while issuing commands to his crew, commands involving coordinating, loading, and firing, preparing for incoming impacts, as well as adjusting sails, all of which point to a level of experience that goes far beyond just knowing what these basic things do in theory, especially because of how calm he is. And really, he's displaying two different skill sets here. Some form of experience in commanding a crew and navigating the ocean, but also knowledge and combat experience, maneuverability, positioning, when to brace, like I said, when to load and when to fire. You don't just randomly inherit that. That feels more like a practical skill, especially because it's all simultaneous and being done under extreme pressure. While this is still early in the story and far removed from what he'll later command with the Jackdaw, its upgrades, and its expanded arsenal, it's worth recognizing that the foundation for those later feats is already present here, even if it is easy to overlook, given that this moment serves as the player's introduction to him. After managing to sink several enemy ships and believing they had taken down the primary threat, Edward and the crew allow themselves a brief moment to celebrate, watching as the opposing vessel erupts in a dramatic explosion. This celebration would prove to be short-lived, though, as members on his ship would point out that within the engagement, the enemy vessels had managed to light their stockpile of munitions on fire. Running towards the direction of the stockpiles, Edward would attempt to help put the flames out and get the ship back under control. However, as another violent explosion sends him back, the captain right behind him was unexpectedly taken down by the same man Edward had seen just moments ago, standing on the ship that was now currently seeming to deal with the same fate that his ship was on the border of. As Edward and this unknown figure prepared to showdown with one another, the ship's stockpile of munitions explodes violently, throwing both men overboard and sending them sinking into the depths below. As Edward is sinking, we get one of the flashbacks between him and Caroline. Since I've already covered the relationship and what they went through prior to us meeting Edward for the first time, what I want to do here is instead focus on the reason this happens and what it may really mean for Edward. Personally, I believe this is both him facing the idea of failing, as the whole point of leaving Caroline to become a privateer was to become something greater, to achieve riches, distancing himself as much as he can from that rural life he resented so much. Privateering was at an end, while pirating, for Edward, it was beginning to get a foothold on him. His father-in-law had no faith in him succeeding out here, period. So much so it infected Caroline's faith within him. He had yet to actually succeed in any meaningful way, and do so in the timeline he gave himself. In essence, it's the moment where his life flashed before his eyes, proving people right against him. A mixture of refusing to accept a life of mediocrity while branded a failure. Could it also mean he was drowning and his final thoughts were on his wife who he loved dearly? Perhaps even having a moment of regret, longing to be back at her side and wishing he just decided to listen to her? Absolutely. However, if we take into account the focus on Edward's objectives as the story progresses, simply saying he misses her here and loved her so deeply that's where his mind went to as he was drowning undercuts some of the depth Edward himself has. Some of the greatest characters and stories we're given in media has multiple layers to them. Rather than just following linear paths or easy one-note characters to follow, Edward and Black Flag don't have one particular issue but many at various times that go on to overlap or sometimes collide. Edward's own desire for more, as we'll see, would be the very reason why he would end up being discovered as not being Duncan Walpole. Speaking of Duncan Walpole, as Edward snaps out of it and swims out from this underwater graveyard of ships, he swims to the nearby island, taking a moment to bask in the sun and cheerfully laugh off this brush with death. As luck would have it, a few moments later, the same man, ready to kill Edward hours before, would crawl up on the sand right next to him. And for a moment, enemies ready to gut each other at sea are now resting, enjoying the second chance at life on dry land. But the peace, as with all moments of bliss, doesn't last long.
I must get to Havana. Well, I'll just build us another ship, will I? I can pay you. Isn't that the sound you pirates like best? 100 escudos. Keep talking. Will you or won't you? You don't have that gold on you now, do you? Bloody fucking pirates!
Edward would go on to hunt down this injured man in search of gold on him. While succeeding at the former and killing him, the search of his body would reveal Edward would have to go a little bit further in search of some coin, as it looks like nothing would really turn up, but he wasn't completely empty-handed. Documents hidden on this man revealed his name to be Duncan Walpole, and he had a letter that, upon further reading, appeared to be an invitation to head to Havana, where he can expect to be rewarded should the information he promised be handed over. Admitting the author of this letter had no idea what Duncan actually looked like, rest can be assured that confidence in this man's identity would be restored by the very sight of the costume he's wearing, identifying him as belonging to a secret order. Signed, Governor Laureano Torres y Ayala. The knowledge handed to Edward would be everything he could have ever wanted on a silver platter. Knowing a prize waited for the taking, the person destined for it killed and robbed of his clothing, he can now accept his identity for an easy payday, donning on his robes with the destination of Havana at the top of that list. Conveniently on the other side of this island, a group of British soldiers were in the middle of preparing to commandeer a ship in order to continue following their commodore that went ahead to Kingston. As it turns out, these soldiers were under the impression that this ship was full of pirates responsible for the attack last night, the same attack Edward was a part of. It was simply a case of wrong place, wrong time, as the ship was nothing more than merchants who decided to stop and resupply. The soldiers knew no better, threatening to hang the pirates for the attack, resulting in some crewmen to flee for their life. Unfortunately, they'd be gunned down as they ran, including the captain. Edward would go on to wipe out the squad of English soldiers and move on to help a man balled up on the floor who was offering a load of sugar on a ship in exchange of being let go. The ship he's speaking of, sitting in the harbor, would naturally draw Edward's attention, as his last one stood at the bottom of the harbor, on the other side of the island. The man he just saved would share this ship was his, but he had no idea how to sail it, and they appeared to be out of luck due to his captain laying lifeless in the sand. Edward shrugged off the news by saying he can captain it no problem, except there was a small problem. Edward's skill with swords and his nonchalant nature of piloting his ship would force the man to worry about Edward being a pirate and leaving him stranded. Sensing this hesitation, Edward immediately shifted gears, politely asking what his name was, while providing his name in the state of urgent business he had.
I'm Duncan. What's your name, friend?
Steed Bonnet.
Well, Mr. Bonnet, let this stay twixt us. But I'm on a secret errand for His Majesty the King, God save him, and I must get to Havana with speed.
Ah, that is a relief, sir. Havana is also my destination. Our ways lie together.
Natural allies, then.
With both paths aligned to the same direction, Bonnet and Edward sail for Havana, arriving roughly 1 month later. Just enough time for the pair to get to know each other a little bit better, which, while it does take place off-screen, the initial interactions between the two I think is enough to share what that month may have been like. In short, Bonnet is the opposite of Edward. He has no experience in privateering, is fearful of coming within range of a pirate, and sticks extremely close to his career path of selling his cargo off from his plantation. As a married man, he can't even think to consider living the type of life that Edward has. The scene of the two of them sailing out of the island's harbor for Havana ends with Bonnet expressing his thoughts on believing this Duncan has lived a marvelous life. A seemingly innocuous comment, but I think one that begins to plant the seed of Bonnet becoming a pretty important person within Edward's life. The reason being, Bonnet is probably the first person ever to express any admiration or some form of confirmation that Edward has actually achieved what he set out to achieve. Not financially directly, but through a new career path that invokes excitement and awe. Through Bonnet's words on just Edward commanding his ship, sharing he served as a privateer, he has this effect as it taps into the earliest feelings of becoming more. An emotion that is definitely all the more powerful since Bonnet technically comes from a very similar background of working on a plantation and being married himself. And that's not to say in the beginning stages Edward doesn't use him. As soon as they get to Havana, the pair discuss going to the store to buy some new swords, as Bonnet talks about how having Edward nearby for extra protection would serve him well, and he was envious of the nice pair of swords Edward had. Edward, on the other hand, mentioned that they were nothing more than rusty razors. Perhaps Bonnet could help spot him a few coin for the purchase of a proper sword. After all, he did save him. A fair trade, but one that left Bonnet with just enough for a small dagger, rather than a proper sword for real defense. Then there's the fight that Edward initiated. As Bonnet ventures to sell off his sugar, Edward would sit in a corner overhearing a drunk man talk of his time serving as a privateer, waiting for the opportunity when war erupts again and the king calls for his return. Upon hearing this man drunkenly recall his work for the king, Edward would insult him while taking a bottle out of another's hand who has passed out. From here, the confrontation only escalates as a drunk man would say loudly he has seen Edward before, a friend of those pirates down at Nassau. And then he boldly pulls Edward's hood down while saying his name, threatening to break his cover as Duncan.
Oi! Skulk! I've seen your face before! You's mates with them pirates down in Nassau!
Shut your fucking gob or I'll fill it with shot, you hear me?
Edward, is it? You bastard!
Hey, I warned him!
The fight that erupts would go on to incorporate many people here. Getting so far out of hand, a local detachment of Spanish soldiers would end up responding to restore order. In a moment of pure self-preservation, despite technically being in this mess with Bonnet, as if it wasn't for his ship, he wouldn't be here, or for him, Edward wouldn't have some brand new swords, he still would choose to throw on his hood and flee, resulting in him managing to successfully escape from being taken into Spanish custody. However, Bonnet and all of his merchandise, including the paperwork and material of Duncan's, that Edward needed in order to receive the payment from the governor would be confiscated by the authorities. Later catching up with Bonnet at the port, he'd also discovered thanks to his actions Bonnet was beaten up. Of course, his next move here would be for him to learn where Duncan's contents were taken to so that way he can steal them back, giving it the higher priority over Bonnet's stolen sugar. He would take what was stolen back from within the Castillo and actually would return to Bonnet, admitting he wasn't able to retrieve the sugar but would still throw him some reals as some form of compensation, as he asked what Bonnet's plans were. Bonnet would express he'd stay here for a few weeks and then return home to Barbados, as he says, to the tedium of domesticity. Serving as that reflection of where he came from, Edward would offer an alternative.
Will you stay here long?
For a few weeks, yes. Then back to Barbados, to the tedium of domesticity.
Don't settle for tedium. Sail for Nassau. Live life as you see fit.
Haven't I heard that Nassau is crawling with pirates? Seems a very tawdry place.
Not tawdry, liberated.
Oh, God. That would be an adventure. But no, I'm a husband and a father, I have responsibilities. Life can't be all pleasure and distraction, Duncan.
Hey, our Bonnet. The name's Edward, in truth. Duncan's only a handle.
Ah. Secret name for your secret meeting with the governor.
The governor, right. I think I've kept him waiting long enough.
The combination of the strength of Edward's convictions bleeding into his words of rejecting a life of settling and living life as he saw fit, along with taking a moment to pause and come clean with Bonnet about his real name, are two examples that further drives home this connection the pair had. Just moments before, Bonnet shared the excitement that would undoubtedly come with sailing for Nassau, accepting a liberating life rather than being pushed away from excitement out of a fear of pirates preying on him. But then he rejects it, explicitly saying he's a husband and has responsibilities. Responsibilities not too different from the ones Edward had passionately stood against. And for Edward, the time to head to meet with the governor was now, as Bonnet would in passing remind him of the secret mission he had on behalf of the king. Edward's meeting with the governor was the perfect blend of him being just quick enough on his feet to cover his tracks, while the others were just naive enough to not know any better and give him the benefit of the doubt. From the moment he stepped foot on the governor's estate, questions were already raised. Spanish soldiers began to take note of Edward's appearance, as he came off more disheveled than they expected this illustrious Duncan Walpole to look like. The excuse in that regard was Duncan has been at sea for months, so they should cut him a little bit of slack. Next was Edward, of course not knowing Duncan had met the wife of Woodes Rogers, and unable to recall any interaction that he had with her before. Or Julian Ducasse pointing out that this Duncan fellow was horribly equipped for a proper assassin, as he appeared to be missing his iconic hidden blades. A very important item that, if we backtrack to, Edward decided to throw him out, as he was taking Duncan's clothes. His response here was, well, his blades were damaged beyond repair. Technically, another alarm should have been raised when Julian pulled out a case of hidden blades, allowing Edward to take his pick. As he reached in, he would ask where Julian found them. A question worded in such a way his ignorance of what they were, the significance of them, and how they really were procured should have shattered the credence of this false identity. However, that would be overlooked when Edward does go on to display assassin techniques of striking from the shadows as a means to amuse his hosts. It's a small moment, but from his skill set displayed here all the way back to the skill set he displayed when hunting Duncan down in the jungles does show there's some natural skill there, at least enough to buy into the idea that he was in fact legitimate. The trio would move on, slowly making their way to meet with the governor. As they walked, Edward would begin to learn more about these two and some dangers to come his way in the future. Let's begin with Julian. Admittedly, he's got the simplest, most straightforward information here. That basically being he's an arms dealer, or as Woodes Rogers explains it, a smuggler of sorts. As for Woodes Rogers himself, he'd share that he has been out at sea for the last 14 months dealing with pirates out in Madagascar. It took some time, but he's happy with the results, hoping to implement those same tactics here soon. What were those tactics, you may wonder? Simple. Rogers shares pirates have the brains of apes, so he gave them an offer they would be able to understand due to its simplicity. Accept a pardon and return to England. They may be poor and penniless, but at least they were free. The alternative was to be hanged by the neck until death. Edward would question if his next target would be Nassau, to which Rogers confirmed it was indeed. Edward, doubtful of the success he'd be able to find in doing so, gave a simple best of luck. And at last, they would come to face the governor directly, who would question the timeline as Duncan was expected a week ago. Edward again would mix a bit of truth in his elaborate lie, sharing that pirates attacked his ship. It was scuttled in the end, and he barely arrived yesterday. No matter, here's what the governor was after: a collection of secret maps and a strange artifact, a glass cube. Satisfied with the delivery, he'd welcome Edward as a brother. And the four men retire deeper into the governor's estate, where the three men are inducted by Torres into the Templar Order. Of course, this is a huge point where Kenway is inducted in and first hears of the observatory, the main objective that would come to overshadow his obsessions of becoming rich as a pirate, believing he can sell off the secret of the observatory's location and what lay within for an untold fortune. An obsession that was so strong it would dominate his thinking for the next couple of years. But briefly, I want to discuss the comments Torres says as he places the rings on the finger of each man. He says as they come together, they represent England, Spain, and France. Sad, corrupted empires, but they are now Templars, the secret and true legislators of the world. Mark and remember their purpose. As he places the ring on Julian, he says,
"To guide all wayward souls till they've reached the quiet road. To guide all wayward desire till impassioned hearts are cool. To guide all wayward minds to safe and sober thought."
Geographically speaking, Julian represented France, Rogers and Edward England, and Torres Spain. But in terms of those individual words spoken to each man, I believe it's Torres acknowledging each man's faults or personal habits that could lead them astray from their mission, and doubling down on this idea that the Templars are perfectly equipped to help them. For Ducasse, who has a history of mercenary work, disgusted and tired with the way that the French government is ran, he's cynical on the system that he's been serving within. France gave him endless wars, political games, corrupt leadership, and no real purpose beyond profit. The key for him was to remember his purpose. As a mercenary going through the motions, the Templars are offering him a sense of meaning found within the destination, and thus no more senseless wandering. For Rogers, he has and will fully be seen to become completely obsessed with civilization, law, stability. His entire Nassau campaign 2 years later is surrounded around cooling passions. Pirates want freedom, merchants want profit, governors want power. Everyone acts emotionally. The words spoken for his induction is an echo of what his actual mission is. Then there's Edward, or Duncan Walpole, as that's who Torres believes he's speaking to.
To guide all wayward minds to safe and sober thought.
Walpole was an assassin. The assassins aren't driven by soul or by passion, but by their ideas, beliefs, and their philosophy. As far as the Templars are concerned, they possess dangerous ideals, romantic notions of freedom, and a reckless faith in human choice. Duncan abandoned that viewpoint of what the Templars would have seen as fantasy to come here and embrace reason, bringing him here to be guided by minds safe and of sober thought. It's only coincidental that that also fits Edward, driven by quick, fast profit no matter how dangerous. He's a daydreamer. It clouds his judgment. He wouldn't be here if that wasn't the case. As the meeting proceeds, he's introduced to Torres' target, a place he refers to as the Observatory, explaining this as a forgotten place of the precursors located somewhere out here within the West Indies. For 20 years now, he's attempted to pinpoint its location, believing it contained an incredible utility and power. Power described as allowing you to locate and monitor every man and woman located on Earth, a device removing all secrets among men. The problem is only a sage knows the whereabouts of the observatory. As of now, they believe a man by the name of Roberts, who is currently within their custody, is this sage, and he's en route for Havana, meant to be delivered tomorrow. A magnificent occasion, no doubt, as no sage has been recorded for the last 45 years. If it's true, Julian warns that an attack by the assassins will be expected, something inevitable but of trivial concern for Torres thanks to the information Duncan here has provided. As Torres prepares a toast for the new day arriving tomorrow, Edward takes the opportunity to steal some maps before joining in with the toast, and being informed to show up at the harbor by noon the following day. The next day would end up becoming a day further complicating things. For starters, Bonnet, as it happens, would cross Edward's path as he met with Rogers, calling him out by his real name. Again, thinking quickly, Edward covers the slip up by telling Rogers he gave Bonnet a fake name, only to look back at Bonnet to tell him he'll catch up later. Considering he actually does later that evening, his dismissal of this humble merchant was actually well-meaning. Yet another example of him subtly becoming that much more significant to Edward. But then there's the sage. Truthfully, the only notable thing here is Edward goes on to learn what Roberts actually looks like, and witnesses Torres take a sample of his blood within the cube. This, in addition to the maps and information provided, does give the Templars a considerable advantage over the assassins, while putting Edward in a very unfavorable position as far as the assassins are concerned. And it only gets worse, as he goes on to kill a handful of them in an effort to protect Torres and the sage. The delivery of Duncan's goods could have been classified as a mistake of naivety. Getting actual blood on his hands is a little harder to defend. Then again, does it really matter, as through all of this, Edward is just going through the motions. As he's informed on the precursor race, he just shrugs it off, as he doesn't believe it. The observatory sounds important, though he has no clue if it's real or just a powerful form of hearsay. All he was after was the reward promised to him, which he finally gets after recapturing the sage, who attempted to run away as a handful of assassins ambushed the group of Templars. Through all of this work, the great payday he expected was nothing more than a very meager wage. 1,000 reals, the same of only 100 pounds at most. Angry, he'd later catch up with Bonnet outside of the governor's residence, expressing his disappointment in Torres' tendency to hoard wealth and reject Edward's chance of gaining proper riches. There's a way to make this right, though. The observatory the governor talks about endlessly. If he can sell it to the right people, he'd become the richest pirate or privateer. I actually find it quite interesting how he still tries to hide his real nature from Bonnet. Out of his own safety or Bonnet's is a bit more difficult to pinpoint compared to the shift in Edward's obsession. From here on, he's no longer interested in pirating. Well, he does go on to engage in those acts later, it's simply a means to an end. His greed and desire for more would push him this night to break into the governor's residence and learn directly from the sage where and what the observatory is. Unfortunately for Edward, someone had already beaten him to it. As he reaches where Roberts was held, he'd discover him missing with nothing but a trail of dead Spanish soldiers and the governor.
What is your true name, rogue?
It's, Captain Pissoff.
Bien que pauvre paysan.
Where is the sage? Did you set him free?
I had nothing to do with that, much as I wish I did.
Take him to the ports. Send him to Sevilla with the treasure.
Oh, wait now! I delivered your treasures, didn't I?
You did, yes. But you robbed us of Duncan, Walpole.
Edward. Much thanks for your aid back there.
Adewale.
Ever been to Nassau, Adewale?
Not yet.
Discovered as being a fraud and punished for, as Torres said, robbing the Templars of the valuable asset that would have been Duncan Walpole, Edward would be thrown on a ship that was a part of what was referred to as the Treasure Fleet. This was an armada of Spanish ships destined for Spain. After some amounts of days on board, he and the man he was chained up with would end up breaking free from their restraints, rearming themselves, or specifically in Edward's case, collecting all of his things taken from him. This included the map he stole from Torres back in his villa. From here, the pair would proceed to jump ship to free as many captured men as they could. A plan derived from saving them from whatever horrible fate awaiting them back in Spain, as well as obtain enough hands to properly take control of one of these Spanish ships and sail off as free men. Under the cover of a disastrous hurricane, their escape attempt would be as incredible as it was dangerous. Echoing the night he encountered Duncan, Edward would take the helm, shouting orders as Adewale snaps into position, ensuring the men knew exactly what to do. Despite the cannon fire hailing down from the other Spanish ships that immediately began a pursuit, and the increasing aggression of the hurricane, they would manage to escape, albeit not without some marks. As the sun rose the next day, the two men would now formally introduce themselves to each other. An interesting time to do so, since who knows how long they were captives together, possibly thinking it didn't matter what the name of the man next to them was, as their predicament was all the same. Now as free men, Edward would come to meet Adewale, along with sharing his thoughts of claiming the ship as his own and sailing to Nassau. Two decisions Adewale appeared to have no qualms with. I want to take this moment to discuss Adewale, because for Edward he was a genuine friend. For the success of the Jackdaw, the name of Edward's ship that he expressed with Adewale was named after a sly bird he loved as a child back in his birthplace of Swansea. The name is of course an emotional anchor of where Edward came from, perhaps of a happier time or even of an animal representative of the sense of freedom he always craved. As he shares the name of the ship, the pair would go on to discuss the feelings over who properly deserved the ship, and Adewale would admit he wasn't delusional. Thanks to the prejudices of the time, he knew the men on the ship wouldn't sail under him, so captain wouldn't suit him, but Edward's quartermaster would be perfect. Thinking it was fair and just for Adewale, Edward accepted him as such. Although truthfully, Adewale was perhaps a bit more experienced than Edward. Similar to his captain, Adewale had experience in piracy. Born and raised under slavery, Adewale ended up escaping and joining a group of pirates that raided the storehouses of the plantation he was serving on. Killing his master and stealing a crate of sugar as a way to gain favor with the pirates, he would go on to escape with them. And from 1718 to 1715, he joined their pillaging all around the coast of Havana, learning the skills of a proper pirate and seafarer. That was until 1715 when the ship he was on hit a sandbar in Havana and he was captured by the Spanish. Taken back by his impressive command over Spanish, French, and English, he was going to be sent to Spain on the Treasure Fleet as an interpreter. Thanks to his run-in with Edward, however, he was back to sailing on the high seas, showing off his skill set as such. As Edward was focused on Nassau, it was Adewale who shares the proper condition of the ship, the crew, and the importance of docking for a while so the crew can get some proper rest and recovery before heading out to Nassau. In other words, from the outset, Adewale suited being this ship's quartermaster well, thinking in more practical terms as opposed to Edward's more fantasy-based ambitions. The pair would arrive at this haven of free-thinking, liberated scoundrels in September of 1715, roughly 2 months after Edward's discovery of not being the man he claimed he was back in Havana. As the two were sliding into the port here at Nassau, they could see off in the distance Edward Thatch and Benjamin Hornigold, the two men Edward Kenway sailed with before the end of the war between England and Spain. The pair were taunting an English soldier. The ones who truly possessed power here was indeed on the other foot. But it wasn't just the change of power that was encouraged here that drew Edward. Once disembarked, he and Adewale would head to the main pub, where after a handful of months at the least, Edward, Hornigold, and Thatch would reunite.
By God, you're a sight for salty eyes. Come you in and have a drink.
Morning, all. Ahoy, Kenway. Who's this?
Adewale, the Jackdaw's quartermaster.
Jackdaw. You named your brig after a poxy bird.
Ade, these lads are the better part of our growing confederacy here. Ed Thatch, Ben Hornigold, James Kidd.
You let him carry a pistol, do you?
Peace, Ben.
Ade saved my life. And now we're looking to find a crew to fill out the rest of my ship.
Well, there's scores of capable men about. But use caution. A shipload of the King's sailors showed up a fortnight back, causing trouble and knocking about like they own the place.
Right. I'll see who I can muster.
Apart from coming to Adewale's defense and Hornigold questioning him allowing Adewale to carry a pistol, as Edward says, his goal here is to hire, find men willing to set sail on the Jackdaw. Now I'm going to skip over the recruiting drive Edward does and instead focus on the conversation he has with everyone when he returns. Now I'm also going to advance a little bit and dissect these conversations in two. Upon returning, Hornigold would question Edward on what his next move was, believing that it would be to go out and plunder a bunch of ships. However, Hornigold would discover his eyes are on a much grander prize, the observatory, and he would bring it up to Hornigold, Thatch, and James Kidd. Thatch and Hornigold would both scoff it off, joking about how Edward would prefer fairy tales over gold, thinking it wiser just to go after ships and sail for places that had tangible assets. James Kidd, on the other hand, would share that he's actually heard of this observatory, calling it a rumor, albeit a rumor very similar to El Dorado, a Templar tomb of some kind. Well, piquing Edward's interest as being the only person outside of the Templars that have mentioned anything remotely close to the observatory and appearing to have some concrete knowledge on it, Edward would pull out the documents that he stole from Torres back in Havana, revealing it actually wasn't a set of maps, but a diagram on what he believed the observatory to be, and showing him to Kidd. Despite his clear excitement at the possibility of really making some headway here, his old companions would win out. Immediately, Hornigold and Thatch become important in the sense of taking Edward under their wing, showing him how to properly sail a ship the size of the Jackdaws, and similar to pointing out Edward's knowledge of maneuvering and ship positioning at the beginning of the game, here Hornigold utilizes yet another game mechanic, explaining the proper use of the spyglass, identifying an enemy ship's armaments, how powerful they are, and the type of cargo they could expect should they decide to go after it. This progresses to Edward learning how to board and pillage a ship, as well as raising the black flag, showing his loyalty to no nation or monarchy apart from their own. A monarchy dedicated to the free will of man, mute of any empire's colored flag. Honestly, I'm jumping a few missions here at a time, but think it's best to wrap the events up related to Hornigold and Thatch for simplicity's sake, which are still quite significant, don't get me wrong, as if it wasn't for them, many things would not progress. Edward's knowledge and experience in being a captain would be far less advanced. The improvement of the Jackdaw's armaments and direction to openly attack the Royal Navy's ships to ensure they have enough gold to keep Nassau free would never materialize as a sound battle plan. And finally, Edward wouldn't have the chance to share with them that he doesn't plan on attacking ships forever, as for his goal is to get just enough money to buy some land and status back home. Knowing Edward as well as he does, this would prompt Hornigold to scoff at the idea, pushing back on Edward dreaming about his wife that left him when he can have anyone here at any time that he desired. It's clear, even with his new ship, new crew, and proper mentorship, he still loved and valued Caroline. In a way, the only thing he really eyed out in the distant horizon. As time continued, Nassau itself continued to grow in terms of those who pledged allegiance to it. Coming to total around 500 men, impressive as it was also dangerous, as Nassau itself lacked any proper defenses. It became apparent should England, or any other nation for that matter, start to think the pirates that pledged loyalty to Nassau was a problem. All they had to do was send a significant fleet to the island, and alas, their confederacy would be no more. This created a proposal for proper defense. Edward would be the first to speak up. He recommended that they put all their efforts in actually searching for the observatory, no doubt remembering the power that supposedly lay within, being able to see and spy on any man or woman here on Earth. Thatch, on the other hand, seemingly annoyed of hearing this fantasy yet again, would shut that idea down, and proposed that instead they steal a Spanish galleon, put it out in the harbor as a proper ornament and warning for all those that even sail remotely close to the island, and shift all the cannons to one side. Winning Adewale over, Thatch would come aboard the Jackdaw and show Edward the Spanish galleon he had just in mind, that'll do the job nicely. There would be a problem out at sea though. As luck would have it, as the jackdaw creeped up to the Spanish galleon, the galleon began to come under fire from another pirate ship. An ally, but by the sounds of Thatch's dissatisfaction, a nuisance, as it was a ship commanded by Charles Vane. While not seen directly, this is technically his first appearance, and he does become important to Edward later. For the time being, however, his decision to attack the galleon did nothing but get in the way, as it allowed Spanish reinforcements to engage the jackdaw while the galleon escaped into the harbor of a nearby island. An island Thatch knew quite well, sharing that it's a stronghold of none other than Julian de Cass.
She's sailing for that island.
I know the place. A natural stronghold used by a French captain named Ducasse.
Julian de Cass, the Templar.
Name's right. Didn't know he had a title.
I know the man. And if he sees my ship, he'll know it from his time in Havana, meaning he may wonder at who's sailing her now. I can't risk that.
And I don't want to lose that galleon. Let's think on it. And maybe wait till it's dark before hopping aboard.
The lure of acquiring a real defense for Nassau is what drew Kenway here. Now the killing of Julian de Cass would be the next step getting closer to James Kidd, learning what he knows of the observatory just as much as Kidd would come to know of how intuitive Kenway was, whether Edward knew it for himself or not.
All frowns and furrowed brows.
Captain Kenway, you have remarkable skills.
Thanks, mate. It comes natural.
But you're churlish and arrogant, prancing around in a uniform that you have not earned.
Everything is permitted. Isn't that your motto?
Julian de Cass, the first Templar killed by the hands of Edward, done so by the very blades Julian gave him all the way back in Havana. A grim twist of fate, although more interestingly is, aside from dealing a major blow to the Templars on a personal initiative of protection as Edward had to ensure the rest of the Templars didn't know that he was still alive, it's the words Julian says to Edward as he's dying. Amazed, he can't see past the life of a rogue despite everything the Templars have shared with him. He still walks this path of trivial fortune and glory. His final words are ones that would go on to be echoed by every major character Edward kills from here on out, hoping the hell Edward finds himself in to be of his own making. A warning that would come to hit much closer to home than Edward could have ever realized. But for now, with Julian dead, the galleon seized, and the cove here in Great Inagua open for the taking, he'd do just that, retiring to rest. As Edward is awakened, in what appears to be the following morning by James Kidd, we learn it's March of 1716. Thatch had sailed off toward Nassau with the galleon they had cleared, while Kidd, doing a bit of exploring, shares there's some contents here within the island he wants to show Edward. Leading him deep into the jungle, he would come to show Edward a Mayan statue, asking if Edward is any good with puzzles and riddles, setting this all up for a test of sorts as it's Kidd's way of gauging how strong his eagle vision is. He'd go on to explain that he believes Edward has a natural gift based off the way he thinks, works, and sees the world. Solving the Mayan puzzle to discover the artifact below the dirt here was nothing more than James getting a direct read of how strong Edward's gift was. A gift Edward would willingly elaborate on, sharing he has this sight since he was a kid, although he always mistook it as something from his dreams, never thinking anything more of it. No doubt a successful pass of the test that'll pique Kidd's interest, but then there was the pair exploring Ducasse's home. That could have put Kidd's view of Edward back in check. As he's testing Edward on his view of the world, Edward would come to find as he put some damn fine gear locked up behind a cage. In reality, it was assassin's robes on what appeared to be a deceased assassin chained up locked behind a set of locks. Ducasse had one key unlocking the first lock, but 4 more were left to be found. Kidd would point out that there was a map on the table highlighting 4 other Templars marked to kill their targets, initially believing these 4 are marked as the ones that had the remaining keys. More shockingly was that this was the exact same map Edward admits handing over to Governor Torres back in Havana, even sharing that those targets that are marked on the map are assassin encampments, as far as what the governor was saying. Now, considering we would later find out Kidd was an assassin and used the knowledge of understanding Edward's strength of eagle vision later referring to it as the sense when attempting to cool his master and sparing Edward's life and allowing him inside their sanctuary within Tulum. It all serves for the greater purpose of making sure that if he takes a leap of faith within Edward, it will pay off. This is further hammered home by suggesting here within the moment of Ducas's villa that perhaps Edward owes the assassins a little bit of warning. For Kidd, this would have been a step in the right direction of making amends and not carrying out the betrayal of Duncan Walpole. However, Edward says he'll consider it for a reward, like a kid drawn to a new toy, jumping from the new gear to then only considering warning the assassins in the event of a reward. The insults are numerous, but Kidd would shrug it off, perhaps out of a combination of genuinely liking Edward and seeing genuine potential within him, as later, when he was leaving the cove, he says this cove suits Edward better than the costume that he's wearing. A deliberate jab, knowing the allegiance it signified, but then Edward says a line that reaffirms what Kenway is, for now.
Oh, come on now. We're pirates, kid. We take as we please and become who we like. Self-made men.
But that look ain't you. It's not who you are.
Who am I then?
Hard to tell some days. All I know is you like dangerous prizes.
A pirate. They take as they please and become who they like. Self-made men. But is that really Edward? I said earlier Edward valued Caroline. He may be a dreamer and irresponsible with a strong sense of tunnel vision when he wants something or is interested in something, but the very idea of still being faithful to Caroline, a commitment Kidd has already warned Edward to keep to himself, as pirates don't respect loyalty outside of rum and plunder. The typical image of a pirate doesn't fit him, or perhaps that in of itself is Edward misunderstanding the whole point of being a pirate. He says, become who we like. Piracy was simply a means to an end for him. That end being self-made, becoming someone. Kidd's interpretation of him, though, is someone who goes after dangerous prizes. And that's when they circle back to the observatory. Edward knows Kidd is better informed on the observatory than he let on all the way back in Nassau some time ago. He does. And if Edward's serious about it, you can meet him in Tulum. Tulum would turn out to be the headquarters of the Brotherhood of Assassins here within the Caribbean. At the time of his invitation and subsequent arrival, Edward didn't know this. Funny enough, he also didn't seem to recognize the people walking around here were assassins themselves. As when he finally gets through the many patrolling the island, reaching James at the entrance of a temple, he would refer to these patrols as guarding monks. While it's worth noting his inability to acknowledge these monks as assassins, it's the test itself that Kidd presented here. That's what's truly significant. A kind of final portion of Edward proving himself both in terms of really wanting to know what this observatory was all about, a topic Kidd has done quite well in tantalizing Edward up until now, while the other was his natural skills in bypassing men trained in the ways of striking from the shadows, sneaking past them. And at last, getting this far while hearing he has this sense and has seen what the sage looks like, Atabai, mentor of James Kidd, allows Edward to continue on into their sanctuary. It's here while venturing into said sanctuary, Edward would begin to learn the ways of the assassins, not in the form of being taught or being considered as a proper prospect, but at least knowing their governing principles. Summed up in the simple phrase of nothing is true, everything is permitted. The latter portion of everything is permitted naturally resonated with Edward, latching onto it, expressing how much he enjoyed the sound of it. Upon hearing this, Kidd would begin to chastise Edward on repeating those words but not respecting the true meaning of it. And then Edward snaps back. In a moment of understandable vulnerability, he would tell Kidd he set him up, that he came here accepting his invitation as a friend, completely unaware of the dangers Kidd knew he was walking into before the Brotherhood after everything he did in Havana. And James would not shy away from the truth, expressing the fact that while dangerous, it actually saved him, whether if Edward chooses to see it or not. Coming here and seeing Atabai face to face, confirming he can be used to have a positive ID on the sage, as he was shown him back in Havana, means Edward can both right the wrongs and be helpful with the assassin's cause. If he can't help them win, then at the least he can do so in damage control. They had the Templars on the run until Edward came along and naively gave them the upper hand. And if you can confirm the face of this statue here within the sanctuary as being the same face as the sage, then the assassins can truly understand where they're at within this war. As luck would have it, Edward would confirm indeed the statue hidden deep within this tomb was the sage, confirmed by the two different colored eyes. He also added he watched Torres fill a glass cube with the blood of the sage, similar to the glass cube now in Kidd's hands. With a positive ID, the pair would head back to the surface to speak with Atabai on the confirmation of the Sage actually existing. The race to the observatory was now. The Templars were still ahead, but since the Sage got away, no one knows where he is. The primary objective is to locate him, so they can beat the Templars to the observatory, as only the Sage knows its location. This entire meeting between Atabai, Edward, and Kid is also done whispering. In a moment of careless sarcasm directed at the higher stakes of now racing for the Sage, Edward would ask, "Is this why Atabai is whispering?"
The statue in the temple. Was that the man you saw in Havana?
Spitting likeness, aye.
It seems another sage has been found. The race for the observatory begins anew.
Is that why we're whispering?
Undoubtedly a comment that only pisses Atabai off more, revealing that he's whispering because they are under attack. Templar agents serving under both the British and Spanish flag know where they are and how they operate thanks to Edward's doing, and his mistake of providing that intelligence, as it turns out, also created a self-inflicted wound, as Edward's crew was taken hostage by the attacking forces as well. Atabai would sarcastically question how much his crew really means to a selfish man like Edward. Selfish or not, the display of utilizing the blow darts handed to him by Kid, in addition to taking on English guards and saving his crew and assassins held as prisoners, Edward's skills would go on to impress Atabai. But that doesn't change anything. Atabai says he's rude, arrogant, and has no right to wear the uniform he's still walking around in, even if the phrase of everything is permitted is thrown in his face. Atbai's final decree on Edward is, he's absolved of everything he did back in Havana, but he is not welcomed here. The Brotherhood of Assassins' headquarters here within Tulum is off limits to him. Now, upon hearing that, Kid would simply apologize and wish it was otherwise, as he walks away following his master. I do want to say while playing, it may just feel like Kid is going through the motions. First, he wants Edward to see the importance of their creed, understand the true value of it. The depth to him he sees that even Edward doesn't see within himself. But then casually dismissing him, wishing it was otherwise, on him not being welcomed here feels like a casual switch-up. Simply going along with his mentor's decision of not wanting him dead anymore, but also not wanting him to be a part of becoming a friend to the Brotherhood. However, I think it's really the opposite. Edward has already admitted to Adewale James Kidd has a habit of stoking and playing with his conscience like no other. When he talks of the observatory, he shares vague knowledge on it, confirming its existence and he knows about it. But then he deliberately keeps his mouth shut on what it is, how he knows of it, or just about everything he knows about it, for that matter. The observatory is simply a lure to dangle in front of Edward, hoping he gets him to realize it's not the observatory that's the true prize or the end goal, but rather becoming something more. He's already jabbed at Edward wearing the robes multiple times by this point in the story, never making a comment of its origins, but saying things akin to, that costume doesn't fit you. Where'd you get it? Off of some dandy? He's already wearing the robes, displays similar skill sets to them, he just hasn't had that mental shift to evolve beyond prizes that are self-serving. In other words, Kid has been subtly implanting this idea of maybe not directly joining them, but at least coming to the realization that there's something more for him. He knows when Edward wants something, he is obsessive, and he can't stand being denied something that is alluring to him. So saying he wishes it was otherwise here isn't a dismissal of Edward, or coming to sadly understand Edward isn't welcomed here, as I think that he knew that wasn't going to happen. I find it hard to believe he didn't think Atabai would go much further beyond sparing his life. More than anything, it was simply another ploy to get Kenway to see the light. Unfortunately, it'll still take a few years for him to come to that revelation, and a few more major interferences on the work of the assassins. Beginning about half a year later in January of 1717, back within the port of Nassau, Edward finally meets Charles Vane and his quartermaster Jack Rackham for the first time in person. At the same time, while a very small thing, Ed Thatch has come to slowly cultivate his image of Blackbeard, growing out this impressive beard that would elevate him within the pirate's mythos later within the story. It's important for his path and eventual death that impacts Edward pretty strongly, so I wanted to point that out here, but admittedly that is still some time away. For now, everyone's attention is on why Vane and Rackham have finally decided to come this far north to Nassau. Well, gold. They heard the Cuban governor is receiving a major shipment of gold from a nearby fort. The gold perks everyone's ears. The Spanish governor, however, is what Edward is after. Torres, as he says. 2 years have now passed since he last seen him back in Havana, and unlike his actions with Julian de Cass, going to immediately kill him to make sure none of the other Templars know he was still alive, with Torres, Edward's approach is very different. Destroying the fort's defenses, he and his crew from the Jackdaw would storm the main headquarters where Torres was. Showing himself boldly, he greets the governor, who remembers his face and that the last time he was serving under a fake name. That didn't matter though, as what Edward wanted to know was why the governor was so far from Havana. Well, a slaver has claimed to have found the sage. This slaver aims to collect the ransom that the governor has put out. That's why Torres was here, and why he had such vast amounts of gold with him. The gold drew the pirates the knowledge of the sage, Edward, so he would let Torres live, under the condition of having Torres head to Kingston to meet with the slaver, a man by the name of Lawrence Prince, and set up a plan. The plan was for Torres to make contact with Prince as expected, hand him a small portion of the gold, and tell him the rest is close behind. That's where Adewale would come in with the remaining gold from the harbor, make the swap, and leave while Edward watches from a distance to confirm the presence of the sage. A plan that shows he's willing to forego personal vendettas for larger prizes, and, as we'll see in a minute, even convictions. Torres was the one who ordered his placement on the Spanish treasure fleet. He had the perfect opportunity to strike a major Templar down while avenging the misfortune Torres placed on him so long ago. Instead, he spares him for the capture of the sage, utilizing a plan with multiple parts that was flawed to say the least. When they arrive in Kingston for the first time, Adewale here would also share his opposition to this plan and to his captain, outright saying Edward is running the scheme by himself. He's risking losing all the faith from his crew in chase of a fantasy rooted in a plan concentrated around working with a slaver. Having grew up in slavery and knowing how notorious Lawrence Prince was, Adewale shares this plan makes him think ill of Edward. It taints everything Adewale stands for. And as well trying to win Adewale over by saying they'll be rich. To hell with conviction, his quartermaster would point out that Kidd was nearby, stalking his prey. Which goes on to explain the disaster that follows, as Kidd has been tracking Prince down for the last week, waiting for an opportunity to kill him. He seemingly was unaware of Torres' expected arrival, or Edward making contact and striking up a deal with Torres for that matter. And so as Kidd begins to track Torres, Edward steps in begging him to stay his blade, as he can't let either of these men die until the sage is at least secured. Eventually, this all ends up with Prince discovering they're being followed, and thus rejecting to meet with Torres. In turn, this allows Torres to escape, and Edward and Kidd fighting over Edward's greed, costing Kidd 2 targets that he's been after. It's a pretty intense moment that doesn't appear to faze Edward the slightest, only promising Kidd will have his kills in time, and Kidd says he knows. He'll locate the sage, and it's Edward's job once the sage is found to help him kill Prince. The next day, the pair would meet on the top of a windmill, overlooking Prince's plantation. The meeting point does well to serve as a representation of just how different these two are. Kenway thought it appropriate to meet at a pub. Kidd, determined to see this mission as success, has no eyes on drinking but on surveying the landscape before them, and devising a plan where he and Edward would work together. It only makes sense. After all, as Prince is Kidd's target and Edward is after his prisoner. A notion that Kidd does somewhat agree with, but also warns Edward the assassins are after the sage as well. He best think twice on who he decides to cross from here on out. With that reality check, the observation of the plantation below reveals a number of guards and bells around the property to signal for reinforcements, a giant problem. Edward would go on to sabotage those bells, stopping the soldiers from calling reinforcements, while Kidd, on the other hand, will work on the distraction, revealing that James Kidd was nothing more than a character. His, or more accurately, her real name was Mary Reed, and she'll focus on working on a distraction, which amounted to pretending to be injured for the guards to open the door, killing both of them and moving on to finding the sage, as Edward focuses on killing Prince. A success for Edward, or rather, Mary, as Prince is killed, but the sage, sharing he was working with Prince the whole time, unaware the slaver had plans of backstabbing him, would escape once more by ringing a bell, flooding the courtyard with English troops as Mary and Edward attempt to get away.
Aye. Pity about Nassau, and Blackbeard flying the coop.
Well, we'll see about Thatch.
Vane's off to see him now, and I'm following soon.
This is what's left of your experiment in democracy.
Aye.
A full year later, in January of 1718, back at Nassau, Edward's obsession over the observatory has far from slowed down. As he's sitting staring at the diagram of the observatory, he overhears Thatch, Hornigold, and Vane arguing over what to do next. Listening closer, it's about a pardon the King of England has put out for any pirate who wants it. Vane thinks it's a ruse to keep them all weak. Lower their guards so the English can swoop in and take them out while their defenses are lowered. Thatch confirms it's not a ruse at all, as he heard it from a captain in Bermuda. While Hornigold thinks whether if it's a lie or not, the English may very well return to Nassau at any time in force, so they need a plan. Hornigold proposes in the absence of any clear ideas on what to do next, the best bet here is to just lay low. No pillaging, no attacking, no eyes on any ship under any circumstances. He doesn't want to garner any attention from the king. Doing so would compel the king to send his men here and wipe them clean off this island, and this, as he puts it, cesspool is not worth dying for. Thatch, however, has no care for the king's ships or its cargo, and as far as dying for the cesspool, he thinks it is. He expresses this as their republic, a free land for free men. Did Hornigold forget that? It may be filthy to look at, but it's the idea that's worth dying for. The idea of it is what was alluring to Thatch. The same idea that captivated Kenway in his earliest of years and still firmly believed in. Even saying there's sun, rum, and leisure as far as the eye can see, in support of Thatch's position. Still far from any point in growing past a life of no responsibilities. Hornigold, on the other hand, was clearly losing his sense of belief, reflecting on their years of this republic and seeing nothing but years of sickness, idleness, and idiocy. Then they get to the core of the problem. Nassau's being hit by disease, men are dying. It sickens Hornigold to his core. So as a way to appease both parties, Edward proposes they look for medicine to cure the ailments ravaging their little republic, and to do so without hitting any ships that'll draw attention to them. The solution? A Spanish vessel sank 2 years ago with some medicine. It should still be sealed up in their glass vials completely untainted, and so they decided to give this one solid go. Edward would be successful in locating this medicine, but found it was spoiled, a result of sitting 2 years at the bottom of the ocean. This in turn would push Thatch over the edge to fully embrace the image of Blackbeard, believing Hornigold was wrong, too weak to properly call himself a pirate.
Plague and perish. Will we steal medicines now?
Remember the pardon, Thatch. We're to be subtle.
Says Hornigold, a pirate, now too proud to call himself one.
He prefers caution to cannons.
Caution's nothing without charisma. Or if a man plays the fool, then it's only fools he'll persuade, but appear to be the devil. And all men will submit.
And would you be the devil?
Or an audience. Aye. All a big show. Give your quarry something to fear. Some hellish thing from a fever dream. And men will drop to their knees, pleading for their lord before all else.
Oh, God.
Looks fine.
Of course it does.
Theatrics from here on for Thatch would skyrocket, thinking if he embraced this image of fear, death, and something that was much larger than life, then he would reach more success in those who submit before him than Hornigold ever could by just renouncing everything he ever believed in and accepting a king's pardon, only playing himself for a fool. Despite being eager to take the next step forward, Thatch does agree to continue to stay quiet for a little bit of time though, saying that if Edward can't find a proper way to quietly retrieve medicines, he'll handle it himself. And handle it himself he does. Sometime later, Edward would come across Hornigold out at sea reinforcing his ship. He'd ease Edward's worries of being attacked, sharing it was the other way around. Thatch decided to attack a British man of war in a desperate attempt to find medicine. Hornigold thinks he lost it and tells Edward leave him to his own devices. Edward, on the other hand, chooses to head after Thatch and bring him home. While sailing after a trail of wrecked ships, Adewale and Edward would begin to discuss their own opinions on the matter, furthering the divide between the quartermaster's sense of convictions and Edward's loyalty to nothing else but coin. Adewale had a good point, saying both Hornigold and Thatch want what's best for the people of Nassau. Different ways of going about it, but you can't fault them for the intentions. Edward rebuttals, asking if this was even the best course of action for them specifically. Saving a city that isn't worth anything at all doesn't make any sense to him. After all, they aren't men worth governing. They take and spend and live heartily wherever they go. And so within these words, Edward's basically saying he's losing faith in Nassau. It's not even the location that matters to him anymore. It's the idea, the principle, something that lives within them in the way that they choose to live. But if that's the case, what would Edward propose? Adewale asked. Well, the answer is in wealth and power, not politics. If we found the observatory, they'd see enough money to buy the whole of England. Or it might be they become the lord of these kings and emperors like they were the new peasants. Seeing this obsession rise to the forefront yet again, Adewale would finish this conversation by asking if Edward sails for his crew or for himself. With his closing remark, Edward would share that he means the best for these men, but this doesn't sit right with him. He feels like he's running errands and not living his life. And thus, this becomes an ever-moving goalpost. Back in England, Edward dreamed of the open seas. Out on the open seas, he dreamed of a place like Nassau, encouraging men like him. Believing the wealth he was chasing at Nassau became the dream of the observatory. Being taken away from that current dream leads him to feeling like running these errands and not living his life. It's conversations like this that slowly separate these two more and more, but also highlights Edward never changes. Dreams become all-encompassing and blinding. The very nature of a dream is to fill it with the wonderful fantasies you desire and believe you're owed. It's not meant to be obtained. And when the realistic form of that dream that you're chasing, for Edward being Nassau, is handed to you, he, instead of acting to keep that dream alive, he focuses on the next one, transitioning the idea from the location and the significance of the location to it being a notion within them that's alive and well. As they continued to sail, they'd find Blackbeard on a nearby island, outnumbered by British soldiers. Edward would disembark and aid in the fight, discovering Blackbeard was actually chasing a galleon. If they're quick enough, they can catch up and take the medicines on board. Suffice to say, they end up actually catching up to the galleon and boarding it, as well as raiding any storage that they have. One of Blackbeard's men would discover that they in fact did have medicine, but it was only a meager supply. But there was a silver lining. The stamps on the bottles say that they're from Charlestown. Understanding that they can't be out here hitting random ships and hoping that they're filled with enough medication to keep Nassau afloat, Blackbeard tells Edward to meet with him in a month outside of Charlestown. They're going to raid it for its medicine.
Are you not loved, down? Are you not wanted by your wives, and families, and countrymen? How else to explain your government's complete disinterest in your well-being?
Out on full display just outside of Charlestown, Blackbeard would tie some men onto his mast, yelling at them, evidently incredibly angry of how little interest these men's government have in them for it to be this difficult to negotiate, especially given how simple his terms were: hostages in exchange for medicine. For 6 days, there's been no response. Blackbeard, growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress, has come to the only conclusion that makes sense to him now. These men were of no value and hence useless to him. As he begins to consider either killing them or forcing them into his service, Edward would opt to go ashore alone and locate these medicines. A single man would have the key to the storage, saying out loud that no matter how fearless Blackbeard's reputation was, he refuses to bend the knee. As far as he's concerned, disease can run rampant and wipe them all out. Those men out in the harbor were just there to scare them. Even if Blackbeard does decide to kill him, it's a sacrifice this man is willing to make. Knocking this English soldier to the ground, Edward wouldn't kill him, but he does chastise him, pointing out that Thatch only wanted medication and he could have had his men back. It was the first offer anyone could have ever received from a pirate. He should have been grateful. As Edward returns to Thatch's ship, he would share that he managed to bring 2 crates worth of medication as well as supplies to allow them to mix more should need be. While grateful of the success of Edward's haul, it's underscored by learning Thatch has plans on settling up unfinished business back at Nassau and then leaving them. It's an incredibly sad moment as Thatch reflects that he's going into his late 40s, sounding as if to echo a little bit of Hornigold's sentiments before. He's not really enjoying this life anymore and he wants to leave to something more comfortable. It may seem as if this is a major blow to Edward's dream of the confederacy of piracy that is Nassau falling apart, but I think it's more signaling a true end of an entire era to Edward. I mean, Thatch served as his mentor out at sea, taught him everything he knew for years now, and embodied the most fearsome reputation they could have ever known for a pirate, arguably being on the most generational run in the last couple of months all just for the sake of procuring medication for his men. That was all drummed up in a plan to give him a proper send-off, to make sure everyone was taken care of and he was all squared away as he prepared to leave this life behind. And I think the way he tells Edward we'll meet again has one of, if not the saddest moment, reassuring his younger friend who thought they would do this forever that it's okay, they will meet again.
And if I don't find some means to make the fifth a quiet and cozy voyage, I'd rather sink to the devil's doorstep than call myself captain another year. We'll meet again, lad. In this world. Or the one below.
6 months later, in July of 1718, Edward is back at Nassau, caught by the young barmaid by the name of Anne Bonny, writing to Caroline. He goes on to ball up the letter and throw it away, dismissing it as foolish. Caroline could have moved on long by now. Makes sense, as by now he would have been gone for about 5 years. But then their attention is turned to the sound of cannon fire. Shifting from Caroline and Edward's endless amount of love for her, they focus on the sound of cannon fire. The origins of such came from a ship sliding into port. Once docked, a detachment of English troops led by Commodore Peter Chamberlain, and now presiding as governor, right next to him, none other than Woodes Rogers. Since last seeing Edward in Havana 3 years ago, he's become elevated within the English hierarchy, and now is bringing those tactics he delivered back in Madagascar so long ago here to Nassau as promised. Asking to speak with those who call themselves governor of this island. Rogers would request the presence of Benjamin Hornigold, Edward Thatch, and Charles Vane. Edward would not be named among these men, meaning he wasn't properly seen as a representative of the Republic in the sense of thinking he was not significant enough to request his presence upon initial contact made here. It could also mean because of that he kept a much lower profile, hitting less ships as much as the others have. It could have also very well meant that Rogers, along with many other people, believed him to still be dead or not affiliated with Nassau due to the lack of any patrols sent out for him. And of course, Edward being cautious on being seen by Rogers. As a small side note here in terms of Hornigold, even if he chose a more favorable approach in recent memory when it came to accepting the king's pardon, becoming less and less hostile to the king's ships, he still had an impressive reputation as an aggressive pirate from his earlier days, which made it all the more surprising that out of all the names requested to see Rogers, Hornigold was the most willing, accepting his host out on the beach, progressing to show off what little town they had as the group rounded up Vane, Rackham, and two other pirates by the name of John Cockram and Josiah Burgess. As this group retired to the old decrepit fortress on the other side of the island to discuss the terms of the pardon, the split among men was clear. The Commodore favored a less diplomatic approach, thinking it weak to offer these men a way out. He preferred burning all the ships, razing the town, and killing everyone here. Rogers was more practical. It was his call to block all ships from leaving the port. In lieu of any proper trials, the only options these pirates had was to accept the pardon or be killed. Until then, as they thought about the path they chose, no one was leaving. This is where Hornigold would become, as Vane and Edward would come to put it, a turncoat. Fed up with having to face the fact that they pissed away the chance of success for Nassau to be something, he felt it was best to accept the pardon and move on. Cockram and Burgess would do the same. Taunting, they'll see Vane on the gallows soon, and over the next few days, Edward and Vane would watch and discuss as Hornigold began to spend more and more time with Rogers, walking about the island without being touched by any man. A giant signal to them that Nassau was indeed over. But they won't accept being trapped and eventually killed here. Edward would disclose with Vane that as he was taking part of the meeting within the fortress, he stole the Chamberlain's plans, helping him formulate a plan on how to escape. According to the document, the English have offloaded their supplies ashore. If they can steal some gunpowder and pine pitch, they can sail out a fire ship directed at the blockade, providing an opening for them to sail out to Edward's compound back at Great Inagua. Tired of Hornigold's self-righteousness and angry he put up with it for so long, only to see him become a traitor in the end, Vane would agree with the plan. He'd procure the pine pitch, Edward the gunpowder, and they'll use Rackham's ship as a vessel to be sunk. Not like he was a useful captain anyway. In the absence of Thatch and Hornigold moving on, needless to say the breakout from the port of Nassau did a lot in terms of bringing Vane and Edward pretty close. Prior to this breakout, there wasn't much on-screen time of these two together. I suppose blowing the harbor in spectacular fashion, opting to continue to live as they please, would serve pretty well to bring them closer, especially without the influence of Thatch, who didn't care much for Vane. Really though, Edward's time with Vane is quite short overall when you think about it more. There's working together to escape Nassau, heading to North Carolina in search of Thatch, hoping he'd return to their cause and help them as Hornigold and many others are abandoning them. And then there was the short-lived pursuit of the observatory, but we're getting ahead of ourselves as before heading for the observatory there was Thatch. As I said, Thatch is back in North Carolina, celebrating his retirement. He had no desire of returning to the life of piracy, especially with Nassau now gone. To him, an ending meant his time had come as well, a sentiment Edward didn't share but also expressed he had no wishes of pressuring Thatch into returning. This was his party and his desire to move on after all. Unfortunately, as I said at the beginning of this video, time and circumstances aren't always working within your favor. While Thatch was focused on celebrating his life of retirement, the English Navy had been preparing to bring about justice for all the carnage Thatch had unleashed over the last few months. They had a mole Infiltrates crew who waited for the perfect time for Thatch and many of his men to be in a drunken state, incapable of putting up an effective resistance. When the time was right, the mole went on to shoot a signal flare into the air. Moments later, it'd be met with a massive volley of cannon fire raining down on the island, killing many ashore, sinking countless ships, save for the Jackdaw. By the time Edward returns to the helm, he finds Blackbeard on board, ready to, as he says, send the king's finest to their graves. Despite being drunk and overfilled with joy just moments before, this has all been replaced with excitement and anger to return one final time to the thrill of battle. Their goal was to take out the massive man-of-war just outside the harbor. Incapacitating the ship, Edward, Thatch, and the Jackdaw's crew would board. Unaware of the sheer number of men on the man-of-war though, this would turn out to be a mistake, as Edward, Blackbeard, Thatch, in front of Kenway, would be struck down. His final words are a reflection of the strength, will, and tenacity they had, but overcome with the desire of fortune.
In a world without gold, we might have been heroes!
The death of Blackbeard would understandably hit Edward hard. He's lost many men at sea before, but not a close friend like Thatch. Not in the way he went out in front of Edward's eyes without being able to help despite him trying his absolute best. The somber mood would overtake him, but as if in a way of carrying Thatch's spirit on, he'd recenter his focus on the observatory. The reason I say that is because right before Thatch's camp was hit by the volley of cannon fire, Thatch shared he heard of where the sage was located. Knowing his friend fixated on finding him, he would tell Edward Roberts appears to have stolen a slave ship called the Princess. Find the princess and you find your man. Interestingly, while it works to push the narrative forward and helps refocus Edward's obsession towards the sage and ultimately the observatory, Blackbeard sharing what he knew does further add to give up on his piracy. Remember, the whole time Edward discussed the observatory as being the answers to their problems. Blackbeard always got angry and shut it down as nothing more than a fantasy. They need to be thinking in practical, more traditional terms, not chasing this rumor. With him moving on from these dreams of pillage and plunder, he helped with the fantasy he did nothing but shut down so many times before. And it's within this obsession that Edward's pull towards the observatory changes one more time. Before it was all about the thrill of discovering something so powerful and immense that he can sell it off to the highest bidder, becoming a legend among pirates. Then it became being the answer to Nassau's problems. Now I think it's shaped up to be the last thing Edward can really hold on to, representative of at least being able to pull something out of what ultimately amounts to an absolute failure. The observatory became a dream on the horizon that would go on to defy the doubts and failure he was cursed to have from venturing out at sea to begin with, that continued to the death of Nassau. It was also a thing that kept him going at a time when everything was lost and continuing to fall apart. Following Blackbeard's death, Vane, the person Edward had come to grow quite close to, would lose his mind after he and Edward were marooned on an island thanks to Rackham, betraying the pair, overtaking the crew of the Jackdaw, stealing it, and leaving both Edward and Vane behind. Edward would continue to have a mentality centered around making sure they both worked together to stay alive and head home. But Vane became a victim of the harsh circumstances, stealing food from Edward for his own survival rather than working together. and eventually he would come across an old Spanish armory that, instead of deciding to use for hunting, Vane opted to use it as a means of defense against Kenway. Ultimately, Edward would have to leave Vane behind due to his combative nature and losing all sense of reality. Prudent but regrettable, as Edward would later come to feel quite sorry about having to leave Vane behind.
I grow tired of chasing these fantasies of yours, Edward. As does the crew.
Hang in there, man. We're getting close.
For Christ's sake, Edward. Don't anything but the stink of riches wrinkle your nose. Put your ambition to better use, Kenway. Find the sage with us.
I've no stomach for you and your mystics, Mary. I want a taste of the good life. An easy life.
No one honest has an easy life.
Over the next year, Edward would continue to hyper-focus his attention on finding the sage, so that he can finally come to reach the observatory. A desire Adewale increasingly shares with Edward is not shared among the crew of the Jackdaw. If anything, it's beginning to wear more and more thin on them. They don't buy into whatever this idea of the observatories meant for Edward. It truly is a path that he walks alone. Meanwhile, Mary, seeing Edward has not given up on his ambitions of finding the sage, does her best to convince him to go for something larger than himself. All he's ever been is attracted to his own desires. An easy good life, as he puts it. A shame, as Mary continues to share that she sees something much more within him, but he can't see it himself. Now, I see no need in repeating mission to mission on what transpires, as really the underlying thing for this next full sequence is the same on all sides. From Mary and Adewale growing tired of Edward's loyalty if nothing else beyond just himself. That very sense of loyalty would lead him to, despite being against warnings of Adewale, to trust Roberts, strike up an alliance with him, resulting in Edward wiping the Templars' trail in the form of killing the pirates Cockram and Burgess, who are now hunting Roberts on behalf of the Templars. Edward would then go on to raid a Spanish galleon in search of treasure Roberts doesn't share the nature of until after it was secured, that being the blood vials of Lawrence Prince, Torres, Rogers, Hornigold, among many others. All necessary pieces of information once the observatory was accessed, and finally tying up that loose end that was Benjamin Hornigold, killing him right before gaining access to the observatory. While these actions continue to escalate his isolation from his own crew and possibility of working with the assassins, I do want to point out the dying words of Cockram, Burgess, and Hornigold as they again point out to Edward the very things so many have done. He lacked any sense of loyalty and conviction. Cockram and Burgess, for example, joked Edward was foolishly driven by his own ambition just as Hornigold said he was. He may have succeeded at ending their lives, and they may be traitors in his for accepting the king's pardon, but Edward also has it all wrong. At a time when Nassau was failing, people were sick and dying. It wasn't the king or their country who took them in, it was the Templars. They gave them a second chance, welcomed them as proper brothers, and showed them more to life. And it's out of that gratitude that they were loyal. The Templars were their family. Where was Edward's? With Hornigold, it's a bit more complicated. He was as much of Edward's mentor as Thatch was, possibly more. His acceptance of the king's pardon was the ultimate betrayal within Edward's eyes, a rejection of all Nassau stood for. Everything Edward knew was based on principles and methods learned by Hornigold. His emotional outburst at his former mentors siding with the kind they once hated shows the hurt, especially when you consider there's no outburst like it from Edward prior to this, emphasizing the magnitude with it. But again, Hornigold says Edward has it all wrong. The Templars are different, they stand for something. It's still no king or country he pledges allegiance to, but a higher cause. A cause Edward appears to have abandoned in pursuit of his own pride. He has nothing to show since Nassau fell, apart from murder and mayhem. Unlike the stinging wound of asking where Edward's family was, Hornigold's final words feels a bit more compassionate, albeit sympathetic. Wishing Edward could see down his current path, he'll find himself to be walking it alone, and it's a path that leads to death.
The heart of a traitor who thinks himself better than his mates.
Aye, and proven true. What have you done since Nassau fell, huh? Nothing but murder and mayhem.
You threw in with the very kind we once hated!
No! These Templars are different. I wish you could see that. But if you continue on your present course, you'll find you're the only one walking it. With the gallows at its end.
Hornigold's death would be the final nail in the coffin before Edward's final wake-up call and ultimate transformation. But it does make you wonder how much of Hornigold's final words are actually true. Edward was introduced to the Templars and their principles some time ago back in Havana. Believing the world was corrupt and sick, they offered a different way from the set norm. But because it never suited Edward's ideals of coin and perhaps the more subtly important idea of freedom, which sounded to be more an encouragement of a life of leisure and idleness, it feels like he would come to see that as the exact same as siding with the country. His idea of being free seems to have come from the idea of not being held accountable. As an example, we can backtrack to his conversation with Adewale about feeling he isn't properly living his life, while they search for Blackbeard, out causing havoc, all in the name of acquiring medication. But then there's also this scene here. For context, Nassau had just fallen. Vane and Edward had recently broken out of the blockade with the fire ship and retreated to Edward's compound back at Great Inagua.
You missed quite a time.
Aye. Pity about Nassau, and Blackbeard flying the coop.
Well, we'll see about Thatch. Vane's off to see him now, and I'm following soon.
This is what's left of your experiment in democracy.
Aye. We do as we please here, and we take our time doing it.
For Christ's sake, Edward. Don't anything but the stink of riches wrinkle your nose.
What's got into you, man?
Reality, mate. Reality. See that you ain't pulled into the drink by this drowning rat.
Oi! I've lived longer than most men who trod this path.
He somehow manages to see pride in nothing more than a bunch of drunken people lying about pissing around, mistaking laziness for something grandeur. Blinded by ambition and convinced the motto of self-serving as justifying the lack of his commitments, he would go on to be led astray by Roberts, a trap of his own doing. Roberts appeared to be similar to Edward, although a bit more to the extreme in terms of his own personal desires and ambition, focusing on his own goals of reaching the observatory, using the jackdaw and Edward's greed to secure everything he needed, keep the Templars off of him, and clearing the natives of the land guarding the observatory, all while dangling the prize in front of Edward's eyes, simultaneously sharing his code of conduct or motto of a merry life and a short one, having no room for the sense of loyalty and ultimately betraying Edward. But not until after he let him in on the full value and secret of the observatory. Edward's first-hand knowledge of the hallway filled with blood vials, security system that can be triggered, and the artifact within the observatory that allowed you to see through the eyes of the person whose blood you entered into the skull would later come back to serve Edward's new belief system of being a powerful device that no one should ever control. Of course, he wouldn't see that in the moment, rather having the smaller ambitious goal of dominating the sea. Really, it's not until Roberts betrays him to die in the observatory, managing to escape, although badly injured from a thick branch that got lodged into his abdomen, forcing him to crawl out on the beach, does he also realize the jackdaw left. Adewale's warnings of everyone growing tired of Edward's antics meant he was alone and too injured to defend himself from Roberts, who decided to turn him into the English authorities in Jamaica so he can cash in on the high bounty on Edward's head. This brings us to Port Royal, Jamaica, April of 1720. Edward's beard indicates he's been here for some time, and as he's escorted out into the main courtyard watching a trial take place, he would quickly learn, as luck would have it, this trial would be of his two friends, Mary Reed and Anne Bonny. The latter was seen through Jack Rackham's eyes all the way back in the observatory, being convinced by Mary to come along and join their life of piracy. Apparently, Mary succeeded in her persuasion. Now the pair prepared to be hanged by the neck for piracy, a verdict that would be postponed due to both women revealing they're pregnant, so the death sentence shall be awaiting them only after the delivery of their children have been made. So they'll settle here for the next 4 months or so based off the time skip that we're given a moment later. Edward, on the other hand, was given another rude awakening. As he's watching his friends be put on trial, none other than Woodes Rogers and Governor Torres appear behind him, calling him by his full name, the lineage of his parents, where he was born, and the fact that he was married at 18 years old to Caroline Scott. They clearly did their research and now finally know who exactly it is they're talking to. While commenting on the unfortunate circumstances of Roberts' betrayal, they do offer an alternative from death. Rogers here has the power to both keep the authorities at bay from killing Edward and even setting him free. His life lays within the decision to help them or not. Tell them where the observatory is and he'll be set free. Best to not take too long though, as time isn't on anyone's side here. Now, considering Edward was no assassin, made it clear time and again he had no loyalty or ties to anything apart from himself. Really, it's a wonder why he didn't take the offer here. He's proven himself capable to both factions, and now he has information valuable to everyone. He too could have accepted that second chance Cockram and Burgess were so grateful the Templars gave them. The very thing they wanted could have been handed over to them on a silver platter, perhaps even negotiating some favorable terms if he was a little aggressive about it, but he refused, opting to stay quiet. Maybe it really was his spirit was temporarily broken here. His friend, Adewale, took his crew and vessels, so it's not like they were really coming back, at least not in any sense Edward can count on, and he just heard from Torres that Caroline was sick these days, the first he'd hear of her at all in the last 7 years. He left back in 1713, and from 1715 onwards, he never appeared to hear anything back from her at all. And now with Mary and Anne waiting the same fates he was, perhaps it just all felt as if the writing truly was on the wall for them. He does show a bit of fear in this entire scene. A few times here, from the moment he walks onto the courtyard, learning it's Anne and Mary that are on trial, to Torres and Rogers sitting behind him. He has no comments or extra words for them apart from a small threat when Caroline's name is mentioned. The lack of any words or any animation is a stark contrast from the biting sarcasm he threw at Atabai's way all the way back in Tulum so many years ago. He was lost. Freedom wasn't what he needed, a sense of direction was, just as Mary has been pushing for him for at least half a decade now. Unfortunately, while he will find that sense of direction and purpose, it would take one more major loss for him to arrive to it, completely breaking him down and forcing him to reflect on everything that he's done in the last 6 or 7 years, understanding that he's done nothing but cause havoc and chaos, and he's taken more steps backwards than he has forward.
For years I've been rushing around, taking whatever I fancied, not giving a tinker's curse for those I hurt. And yet here I am, with riches and a reputation, feeling no wiser than when I left home. Yet when I turn around, look at the course I've run. There's not a man or woman that I love left standing beside me.
As they say, it only gets worse before it gets better. The start of Edward's redemption arc rings very true in this regard. 4 months after seeing Torres and Rogers, he's left hanging in a caged gibbet in Port Royal. Atabai would arrive to free him, but he isn't here for Edward. His goals are Mary and Anne. Edward's free to leave, but if he chooses to help Atabai in freeing the women, he will make sure Edward has a way to escape Jamaica. After utilizing the hidden blades Tabai hands him and showing his skills at striking from the shadows, Atabai and Edward would manage to reach the women at the same exact time. Neither was in a good state though. Mary was barely awake while Anne struggled to stand. They had their children, but left to the dirty conditions within the prison, their bodies were compromised and began to fall to disease. Mary worse than Anne, so bad in fact that she refuses to leave, initially asking Edward to leave her behind, to not get killed on her account. After a desperate attempt to carry her out, she would eventually ask to be put down, where the two would have their final exchange of words.
Don't die on my account. Go.
This is such a pain in the ass. Damn it. You should have been the one to outlast me.
I've done my part. Will you?
If you came with me, I could. Mary.
I'll be with you, Kenway. I will.
Search every nook and cranny!
Mary was in her own way the only person to actually see something within Edward, to push for something more. He never seen that because the validation he was after was in a lifestyle that bore no fruit and a creed as stable as a sandcastle at high tide. If it didn't lead to coin and influence, it didn't matter to him. An extreme of it leading him down a path of even rejecting his own sentiments of the few outweigh the many, as in the case with the jackdaw. Mary's death was more than just another tragedy like Blackbeard's in terms of what she pushed for him, as well as the point within the story her death takes place in is really right here she would be the last true friend by his side. Honoring her memory, he would go on to carry her body back to Atabai, though sharing that he doesn't plan on doing anything sensible now, which, despite his words, is only partially true. Now, Atabai, upon hearing that, would give Edward his robes back, saying he hasn't earned them, but they fit him. An important thing because it's what helps him come back to the assassins later, not immediately, because what he decides to do immediately is head to a tavern back in Kingston where, overtaken by grief and rage, he gets drunk. This results in him dreaming of his obsessions and all he lost along the way. The dream he has begins with Roberts placing the skull from the observatory on the counter, saying,
"In all your years out here, you could never achieve what I've done in 1/5 the time. Because you're a good man, Edward, see? Goodness is your disease."
Not only does this poke at Edward's insecurity and own failure, but he even says the one thing that has been there all along. He's a good man. He never had this cutthroat nature, at least not to the scales of Roberts, and in a way, Edward finally met his match. This all, of course, angers him, yelling at the apparition that the skull that he's walking away with is his prize. Then Roberts reminds him of his creed.
"Remember my creed, boy. A short life and a merry one, that is all. The world owes us nothing more than this. So take what you will, and then die before you live to see yourself made a fool."
It's Edward's own former way of living and his current thinking now. Having focused on personal gains, he had been played for a fool, and then Roberts taunts Edward to take the skull. Bested by Roberts due to his drunken state, he's then brought to another stage of his hallucination. This time it's Roberts still taunting Edward as he walks away. Flanked on both sides are people Edward has known and subsequently lost. Hornigold is first, welcoming Edward aboard, echoing the words of first coming to the life of privateering and then pirating, asking if he's game. Then Thatch as Blackbeard, raising a glass to freedom, to gentlemen of fortune and women of leisure. And Mary responding, toasting to a world full of rogues, better than all kings and queens that kicked them down. Then Roberts saying, as gentlemen of fortune they enjoy plenty and satisfaction, pleasure, ease, liberty, and power. What man with a sensible mind would choose the former life? He's dipped his hands in muddy water and, withdrawing them, finds it better to be a commander than a common man, before transitioning to the final stage, as it does here. Now I want to break this all down as Edward crawls towards Roberts. This whole thing, in essence, is him reflecting on his own life, his choices and everything that it cost him. Hornigold, welcoming him aboard, first introduced him to the life. Thatch and Mary, both equally important to him, had their own creeds to live and die by. And Roberts questioning why in the world anyone would choose a life of a common man. Very much a notion Edward could get behind, but also a sarcastic question within this dream. They enjoy fortune, satisfaction, liberty, and power, but look what it costs you to even enjoy it if you can. If you look closely, Edward is also who appears to be withering away in the caged gibbet up here over Robert's shoulder while Vane and Rackham fight in the background, and then there's Bonnet bending over. It's a glorious death to be lucky to have, like Thatch, Hornigold, and Mary, dying for purposes, things that they actually believed in, their convictions, or you can be taken advantage of like Bonnet, or lose your mind to drink in isolation like Rackham and Vane. Finally, it's the last sequence. Edward is drowning, a visual representation of a death of his own making and a life of his own choosing. When he swims up, he finds himself in a courtyard. Torres and Rogers are telling a story about a jackdaw attacking a ram. The jackdaw believed it was strong and capable enough to take on the ram, but when it went to fly away, it realized it couldn't lift the ram. The ram was too large for the jackdaw, a task too great for it. Even as the jackdaw struggled, the ram was hardly aware it was there. Nearby across the field, the shepherd of the ram saw the bird fluttering its wings and was amused. So he ran up to clip its wings, and he gave the jackdaw to his children as a gift. His kids would laugh and ask what this odd bird was named. He'd say it was a jackdaw, but it believed it to be an eagle if you asked it to. In other words, Edward is the jackdaw. He's delusional, he's in over his head. And this story is accompanied by Edward hunting Roberts down in a crowd of people. Every time he kills Roberts, it turns out to be an assassin, not his true target. Meanwhile, the other sides of the courtyard have Mary, Caroline, and Blackbeard hanging. The other side, Julian DeCass torturing and killing assassins. Now real quick, the reason I say this is Caroline and not Anne is because in the next sequence, Caroline appears to be wearing the exact same clothes here. These three people hanging signal Edward's most important people in his life, or rather they were. But the bigger picture is Edward thinks he's something he's not. He believes he's chasing something when he's doing nothing but causing more trouble. After each kill of Roberts, everyone in the crowd around him stop, all look at him, and point. In other words, he's the one to blame for the entire mess he now finds himself in, even if he somehow managed to convince himself he was doing the right thing. Finally, he's sailing in a hurricane. A hurricane is symbolic to his life, now completely out of his control. Caroline is yelling about promising of being gone for 2 years. Where's he been? Then he would angrily shout at her that she left when he needed her the most. But he already had her. What keeps him wondering? Doesn't she make him happy? He'd plead that he's so close to just let him do this. Close to what, though? There's no land in the distance, no one on the ship apart from him and his regrets, on a course that he has no control over. And then Caroline becomes Mary. She's yelling at him. Is everything that he does out of spite? He would snap back saying, it's not spite that drives him, it's courage. Courage for what? There's no one left in this life to care. And she's right. He snubbed these two important people, claiming he was so close and that courage drives him to continue going forward, but in the end, who cares? Neither one of them are here. Who's he fighting for? The ship is empty. Time is over. Then he wakes up to Adewale. Adewale's arrival was a welcome surprise, despite even admitting he should be angry with Adewale for leaving him behind. A decision that ultimately led to his landing in prison for as long as he was, no doubt. But instead, he's happy. Not only is a friendly face back here, a particular thing Edward would have been desperate now more than ever to see, but he's also returning his ship. However, it's the decision to leave that perhaps is the biggest move here. Since leaving Edward, Adewale has decided to pursue the assassins and find more purpose in life that isn't solely based off one's own greed. Later expressing to Edward outright, he left because he found it increasingly difficult to support someone who only looked after themselves. He's yet one more person surrounding Edward who had a desire for something more. And now after the haunting dream he suffered the night before, he was ready for a change, seemingly even desperate for it. When he returns to the assassin's headquarters in Tulum, he'd outright tell Atabai Mary's final words to him was to do right by her and correct all the wrong that he did. He needs to do this for her. It was his way of avenging her death, honoring her memory, and correcting all the wrong he's done over the last 6 years. Wrong the assassins were still recovering from. The growth here, I think, can really be summed up with Edward now reflecting on the motto of the assassins.
And what do you think of our creed?
It's hard to say. For if nothing is true, then why believe anything? And if everything is permitted, why not chase every desire?
Why indeed?
It might be that this idea is only the beginning of wisdom, not its final form.
He's now ready to see deeper than the surface, no longer adapting it in justification for his own purpose and making a mockery out of it, but instead using it as a moral compass and a real path forward. Now, rather than covering Edward's remaining kills, I want to end this video on the last two emotional beats of Edward, those being Bonnie and of course, Caroline. For Bonnie, after being rescued by Atabai, she would give birth to her son here in Tulum. Tragically, her son would not survive the birth. Upon hearing this, Edward would take a moment to finally catch up with her, sit, sharing the stories he heard in prison of the fearless and dangerous duo that was Mary Read and Bonnie taking on the King's Navy. It was his kind of way of breaking the ice, but also attempting to genuinely lift up her spirit. Apparently, she added, there were stories with truth, and they would have continued if it wasn't for Rackham and his friends drunk in the hold, severely impacting the fighting potential of Mary and Anne, and thus being overpowered by the King's Navy and being captured. No matter, the mood was somber. She was mourning the death of her son, thinking he didn't make it out here in the free world, but if she gave birth to him in prison, as Mary did, the authorities would have taken him, surviving but never getting the chance of mother and son staying together. To her, it really didn't seem like there was any such thing as a positive outcome. He either still died out here or she would never see him. Faced with two hard outcomes that it's difficult to make any sense of logical reason to, she came to the only conclusion that perhaps this was God's way of telling her she wasn't prepared to be a mother. She's still drinking, cussing, fighting, living carelessly. It adds to the emptiness she feels. Rackham, Thatch, Mary, Fame, they're all dead. Only she and Edward remains. She'd ask if he felt that empty too. He'd agree. The devil cursed him with this void he can't seem to clear. On a more positive note, with Adewale gone, Anne would take up the mantle as a Jackdaw's quartermaster, as Edward goes on to make everything right between the assassins and Templars. This would allow both Edward and Anne to stay close and keep the memories of their fallen comrades alive. And what kind of video of Edward would this be without talking of Caroline? Finally getting his head on straight, Edward would now commit to sending letters back to Caroline, taking advantage of the network of the assassins to deliver these letters and make contact with her. It's not until fully taking care of all the Templars and helping the assassins steal the observatory, doing a complete 180 in his previous way of thinking and doing things, does he discover Caroline had passed away the year before. The child she was carrying that was Edward so long ago was now revealed to him as a girl, whom Caroline had named Jennifer. And the game ends as Anne tells Edward he's a good man, and if he can learn to stay in one place, would be a great father as well. And then she sings as Edward looks at everyone he's lost, the life he's lucky to come out of, empty as it may have left him. That emptiness is now ripe to be filled with a new life, a new purpose, and, ironically, a new sense of responsibility that he completely embraces.